Hello, and welcome to the Brown Initiative for Discipleship and Evangelism. I'm Ethan Brown, and this is BIDE. This video is being produced in cooperation with the Partnership Program at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, where I'm a student in the Doctor of Ministry program in Outreach and Discipleship. If you'd like to learn more about the Partnership Program, I'll put a link in the description below. In today's video, I'd like to discuss 3 layers of evangelism. Those 3 layers are make the message known, bring about a valid decision, and lead to persistence in the faith. All 3 of those are valid approaches to evangelism, and as you go deeper, as you get further down into the next layer, you maintain the previous layer's goals. So you really can't lead anyone who doesn't know the message of the gospel to a valid decision. You have to make the message known in order for them to make a valid decision. And a person who hasn't made a decision for God won't persist in faith. You can only bring about that persistence in faith if they've made a valid decision. So at each new layer, you keep what happened before, but you don't necessarily have to go all the way down to the 3rd layer in order to have a valid evangelism structure. I first learned about these different layers of evangelism in a class I took way back in the late 90s with Everett Hufford at Harding University Graduate School of Religion in Memphis, Tennessee. These 3 layers formed the spine of his class on global evangelism, and it's such a powerful model that it stuck with me to this day. So let me talk you through each of these layers and their significant parts, because they really do help us think about our goals in evangelism. At the first layer of evangelism, the goal is to make the message known. So the big thing that you have to figure out is, what is our message? What is it that I'm supposed to tell people? If I'm going to evangelize people, what is it I ought to be talking about? So the word evangelism is a Latinized version of the Greek word euangelion, and euangelion is literally translated as good news. The gospel is the good news, but what good news? Well, if you look through church history, in recent times, it's very obvious what the good news is. The good news is that salvation can be had by faith. That if you put your faith in Jesus Christ, that if you trust Him, then your soul can be saved. And that's the good news that we have to offer. And it is good news. You know, the salvation of the human soul is a really important thing. But is that the original euangelion? Interestingly, if you go back and look at your New Testament and look at the book of Acts particularly, and work your way through the gospel sermons that are found in the book of Acts, you won't find them preaching that gospel. The gospel that they are preaching is that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the saving King that has been predicted throughout the Old Testament. If you look through the Old Testament story, you see that it's all headed towards a king who will resolve all of the loose ends in the Old Testament, that God's story leads to Jesus. And then when the apostles went out to preach, and later when Paul went out to preach, the message that they carried out was not, hey, you've sinned, but God offered a sacrifice for you of His Son on the cross. So if you'll put your trust in that sacrifice, you don't have to go to hell. You can go to heaven instead. That isn't the message they're preaching. The message that they're preaching has that import. It will have that effect. But the message that they're preaching is, you want to have allegiance to King Jesus, because Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. The goal at the level of evangelism, the first level, is to announce the good news, to get out there and let people know. Now, evangelism can be done just at this level. In a previous video, I talked about the difference between cultivated evangelism and wild evangelism. Wild evangelism is where you don't really have very much relationship with a person. It's just that God gives you an opportunity to talk about Jesus, and you take it. Well, evangelism that's done in the wild is always this first level of evangelism. It's almost always happening at the level of make the message known. Why would that be? Well, make the message known doesn't actually require very much relationship with the person that you're evangelizing at all. In fact, preaching in most Christian worship services will have this sort of impact on someone who is visiting a church and isn't yet a Christian. They're hearing a message about Jesus, hopefully, from the pulpit as they sit in the pews and listen to the preacher. Well, that is make the message known evangelism. That person sitting in the pew hasn't met the preacher yet, maybe. Preaching crusades, every Christian worship service that involves a sermon, that's all make the message known evangelism. At the next level down, there tends to be more relationship involved. At the next level down, we are dealing with bringing about a valid decision. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, you can get people to do almost anything if you don't mind deceiving them and you don't mind playing on their emotions. In my other life, one of the things that I do is I teach logic to middle school students, and we have an entire unit in my logic class that focuses on propaganda. Manipulative propaganda all has this one thing in common. I don't have time or interest of really arguing with you. I don't want to do that. What I want to do is get you motivated to act without thinking. So I will try to jump down from your reasoning down to your heart. If I can get you feeling instead of thinking, then you're more likely to act the way I want you to. All advertising does exactly that. Almost all political advertising does exactly that. In fact, most of the time you're hearing from a politician, they are talking to your heart. If you're ever on a jury, the likelihood is that at least some of this manipulative propaganda At least some of this manipulative communication is likely to be going on from the lawyer as they try to get you to feel rather than think. An awful lot of preaching will do that. Now, at some level, preaching to the heart's not necessarily wrong. Communicating to the heart and to the emotions, well, certainly the gospel has an emotional impact. And the emotions can be used to leverage a stubborn mind into acting in the way that it's already convinced that it should act, but it hasn't really decided, okay, I'm going to have the courage of my convictions. And so leveraging through emotions can be about leading someone to a valid decision. But an awful lot of emotional appeals are meant to short-circuit the mind, to just get you to act without really having counted the cost, without really having thought through what this will mean. In fact, I've just gotten you scared, afraid, worried, and convinced that bad things will happen to you if you don't do what I want you to. And so, well, let's get you into the baptistry. If you look at a lot of Christian conversion, there's a big, wide open front door, but there is an equally wide open back door. So you have a lot of people who come to faith and they are led into faith, but then once they're there, they kind of start getting buyer's remorse. What's expected of them, they didn't know they actually were going to have to make any sort of life changes at all. That a commitment to going to worship once a week is a bigger commitment than maybe they wanted to make. And before you know it, they have exited from the Christian community. If you look at Jesus, when Jesus calls people, and especially when people try to call themselves to follow him, Jesus will call those people to count the cost. He'll say things like, birds have nests. Even a bird has got somewhere to live. A fox has got a den, but I got nowhere. I'm just wandering around. You sure you want to come with me? And so Jesus will tell people to count the cost. If you're about to go out and you're a king about to lead an army out to fight, and the other guy's got an army twice the size of yours, can you withstand that army? And if not, you sue for peace. So you count the costs before you make big decisions. And the same is true of business. There's all kinds of fields of human life. You will do cost counting before you will act. Well, a valid decision is one where you have thought through, what is this going to mean for me in my life, before you decide it's what you want to do. So in real evangelism, you aren't leading somebody to make a temporary life decision. You aren't trying to notch your belt with the number of baptisms you can accomplish in a year. Instead, real evangelism will sit with somebody and help them think through, what will it mean for you to follow Jesus? What is that going to look like in your life? If you take that on, how will your life have to change? What things are you going to need to give up? What moral changes in your convictions are you going to have to allow Jesus to confront? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to rethink something if Jesus says you ought to? So the valid decision is one where you've led somebody through some thinking before they make a decision. Now, you'll note you can't make a decision if you don't know the message. So that first level, make the message known, has got to happen before, or at least at the same time as the second level is happening. In order to get to this level, you have to lead them to know a message and make decisions about it. I say that this requires more relationship than this does, because you can, generally speaking, pronounce the message to a crowd of strangers. They can hear it and understand it. But in order to get to the point where, if I am an evangelist working with somebody and I'm trying to lead them to make a valid decision, then it generally means the answering of tough questions. And they have to be a friend that trusts me enough to answer those questions. The kinds of things you run into are things like, well, my dad's dead and he didn't believe any of this stuff. Are you telling me that my dad is lost forever? And maybe I would rather be with my dad than with Jesus. I don't know. How do you, and you're going to have to wrestle with people as they make those decisions. Saying things like, well, if your dad had the information in front of him that you've got in front of you, what do you think your dad would have done with this? Now, you'll note that's not manipulation. That's a genuine question. You're not trying to press to the answer you want at this level. Okay? At the earlier level, you are definitely putting your agenda out there. But at this level, that other person is wrestling and trying to make choices. And a person who's a good evangelist at this level is trying to make those real, valid choices. Not the kind of thing that they wake up with buyer's remorse and say, I wish I hadn't done this. But instead the kind of thing where they say, yeah, this is what I really want to do, whether it's what you want them to do or not. Now, at the deepest level is the highest relational level, and that's where you are trying to bring about persistence in faith. By persistence in faith, I mean that a person continues to be a Christian once they've become one until they die. There are people who make valid decisions and then decide, this isn't what I want after all, and they leave. people are more likely to do that. People are more likely to leave Christ if they do not have solid Christian friendships when a life crisis comes upon them. When their faith becomes challenged, if they have solid Christian friendships who are practicing discipleship alongside them, then they are more likely to follow after Jesus. Obviously, this third layer of evangelism calls for discipleship work. It's where you are training people to observe everything that Jesus commanded us. Remember that Jesus' call is not go and make converts, not go and disturb the baptismal waters, but go and make disciples. What Jesus wants us to do is to lead people to the point where they become obedient and thriving people. Even in the midst of challenge and conflict and trouble, they want to follow him. They want to know who he is and what he has to say, and then to live according to his example and teachings. To do this as an evangelist, if you're thinking evangelistically in other people's lives, your job then is to lead them to be disciples, to lead them to pay attention to Jesus and become obedient to him. Not you, him. That's how persistence in faith is built, because you'll fail them, but he won't. Okay, he doesn't ever blow it with them. The work that he does in the human heart and in human lives is always for their good. So to bring about persistence in faith, you need to constantly be treating that other person as a valid decision maker, a living, thriving mind that you're leading to pay attention to Christ, even as you yourself are doing the same. And it's by the two of you paying attention to Christ that you thrive and grow, and the people you work with do as well. So as you pour your heart into them, Christ is using you in their life to bring about maturity, growth, and wholeness. Now, which of these is right? Well, all three of those levels are correct. If all you can do is make the message known, then by all means do it if the opportunity presents itself. Wild evangelism is true evangelism. It's appropriate to pick the wild blueberry when it shows up along your path. So you go ahead and let people know the message. But I would suggest that a true evangelist is not one who just scatters seeds. They do that, but they have strategic plans to build relationships. And those relationships are relationships on purpose for a purpose, leading to these deeper levels. You are trying to lead people to the point where, together with you, they commit to Jesus for the long haul, for their whole lives, where they will continue to walk with him long after you are gone. Because you may die, and your friend that you have worked with has to continue on. What you want is to establish, to help them to be so established and rooted in truth, knowledge of Jesus Christ and who he is and what he's like, that even if that kind of relationship rupture should happen, they will continue in faith. The reality is that the goal of all evangelism is this third level of evangelism. That's what we want to get from everything that we do, because Jesus is so good that everyone deserves to live and walk with him. So we want to get there, but we can't always do it. As I've mentioned in previous videos, that on average in America, a person who converts to Christ has heard the gospel 9 times from 7 different people. And if you're one of those 7, praise God, that's awesome. And with somebody, it might take 11 or 50 people before they actually make that decision that, yes, I'm going to accept this, and yes, I'm going to follow Jesus. Well, if you're number 35 out of 50, then probably the relationship you have with that person is at that top level. They haven't reached a point yet where they're ready to make any decision at all about what they're going to do with this. And they're certainly not persisting in the faith if you haven't even got there yet. Well, that's okay. It's all right to just do level 1. In fact, there are strategies that are level 1 strategies. There are gospel radio programs, for instance, that broadcast the gospel into places that missionaries can't reach, Muslim areas of the world that are locked down and unreachable, or communist areas of the world that aren't open to missionaries, at least not if the missionaries are overt about what they're doing. Well, the radio broadcast can get where the Christian missionary can't, but all it can do is make the message known. Well, if that's all we can do, then let's do that. But remember that the goal is to lead people into lifelong relationship with Jesus, where they live in faith until they die. That's what we want to do. That's what we ourselves want to do. We want to live with Jesus. Whatever this world throws at me, I want to live with him until I die. And I want to take as many people with me as I can, because Jesus is that excellent. The Christ is just amazing. So we continue to do this, hoping to find opportunities to get to a valid decision and to disciple people so that they will persist in the faith and perhaps join with us in making the message known. We do all 3 levels of evangelism because this is what God calls us to do. God wants us to do this because God loves the world, and he loves the world so much that he sent Jesus. And Jesus sent us for the honor of Christ and for the life of the world.